Well, good morning. Welcome to Wake Up in the Word. We are once again in the Gospel of Mark. We're in day number 19 of the Servant Gospel. So come join me and let's see what God has to say to us this morning. Mm. It's a beautiful Monday morning. I hope you're having a great morning so far in anticipation of a day that's filled with God's blessings, direction, and guidance in the midst of a confusing world. That's where we are. Well, it seems like the disciples were confused. Things were changing all around them, and they really didn't know what to expect from Jesus day to day. As we get to Mark chapter 8, we have an interesting passage. I'm going to cover about 21 verses today with the section we'll call Nine Questions. We'll see why in just a minute. It says, during those days, another large crowd gathered. Boy, this is getting routine, isn't it? Wherever Jesus goes, the people show up. They want to hear what the master has to say. Since they'd had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion for these people. They've already been with me 3 days and have had nothing to eat. Apparently, when Jesus drew the crowds, they did not want to leave. They wanted to stick around because they had been fed well with spiritual food. They just did not want to leave, even if it meant missing a meal. Wouldn't it be great if you had such a dynamic church service on a Sunday morning? People didn't want to leave, and they said, don't worry about lunch. Keep on preaching. I haven't had that happen in my ministry. I don't know about yours, but this is what happened with Jesus. They said that they just wanted to stay. We want to hear more and more from him. In verse 3, Jesus says, if I send them away hungry, they will collapse on the way because some of them have come a long distance. So here's Jesus once again demonstrating God's compassion for people. But his disciples answered. Now keep in mind, we had the feeding of the 5,000 just a couple of chapters back. They've already seen Jesus do what he's going to do again, but they're still just kind of clueless. That's a one time event. That'll never happen again. So they answered, where in this remote place can anyone get enough bread to feed them? Jesus said, how many loaves do you have? 7, they replied. He told the crowd to sit down on the ground, and when he had taken the 7 loaves and given thanks, he broke them, gave them to his disciples to set before the people, and they did so. In verse 7, it's revealed that they had a few small fish as well. So he gave thanks for them also. Apparently, they were brought while the bread was being served, or maybe afterwards. And he told the disciples to distribute them. And so the people ate and were satisfied. Afterward, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. About 4,000 men were present, and having sent them away, he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the region of Dalmanthua. Now, many folks have tried to, as they try to dismiss much of the claims of Jesus, have said, well, this is just a rehash of the previous incident. Really, it was just one time that Jesus got people together and they had some kind of miracle of feeding, and it just kind of got broken up and put in 2 separate places. No, that's not what happened. The Word of God's very clear here. The numbers are different, the circumstances are different. And Jesus even confirms that later when he asks his disciples, didn't you notice what I did before? So, no, it's not the same incident. This is two separate occasions where Jesus provides a miracle of feeding, a feeding miracle. So in verse 11, the Pharisees came and they began to question Jesus to test him. They asked him for a sign from heaven. And here are the people who have been wandering around with him, watching his miracles, seeing him, in this case, just feed thousands of people. One Bible commentator said, if there are 4,000 men here, it's likely that you could have had anywhere from 7 to over 8,000 actual people present for this feeding. So, uh, as you look at this, you think, where have you been? What kind of sign would you need? There are signs all over the place with Jesus. Now, you're asking for a special sign. Give us a sign. How about a sign just for me, Lord? Oh, I know you've done all these other miracles and signs and things, but no. How about one for me? Can you put on the show just for the private group over here of teachers of the law? Isn't it just remarkable that they could be so arrogant? So, how did Jesus react? In verse 12, it says, he sighed deeply. He just went, oh, what do you do to reach these people? They're missing the message. It says he sighed deeply and he said, why does this generation ask for a miraculous sign? I tell you the truth, no sign will be given to it. Now, in Matthew's account of this same incident, he adds the phrase, except the sign of Jonah, talking about his resurrection. If that's not a big enough sign, what could be? So anyhow, he says, no sign being given to you. And he left them, got back into the boat, and crossed to the other side. Now the disciples had forgotten to bring bread except for one loaf with them on the trip. They picked up 7 basketfuls of remnants, but they left them on the other side. These guys, they're some bright guys. Aren't you glad that Jesus came to save folks that weren't necessarily carrying a full load up here? That's us, you know. God didn't just come to save smart people, brilliant people, intelligent people. He didn't set an IQ bar where you and I are and say if you're not above it, you can't be saved. Instead, we see these disciples just have those moments like you and I have all the time. And they're like, oh man, why didn't I bring the bread? We had plenty, but they forgot it. So Jesus uses it as an opportunity to teach. You know, he didn't criticize them for not bringing the bread. Instead, here's what he did. Verse 15, be careful, Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. They discussed this with one another and said, is it because we have no bread? So they're trying to figure this out. Why did he say this among themselves? They still aren't focusing his teachings on the spiritual truths. They're thinking, well, what? Does he want us to boycott Herod's bread or something? Well, what's he trying to tell us? And Jesus is like, no, this is not about that. Verse 17, he begins to teach them, and in this case, by asking numerous questions. You know, sometimes some of the best teaching you can do, you've done this with your children, is to ask a question that they're going to have to think about and answer. And that process in itself teaches them right from wrong, wisdom from folly. It teaches them what to do. So it gets their minds stirring, not just to have it handed to them on a silver platter. So watch the series of questions that Jesus asks. First of all, he said, why are you talking about having no bread? Second question, verse 17, is, do you still not understand? Hang on, he's going to repeat this one. Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? Next question, and don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, and how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? Well, they at least answered him there. They said, well, 12. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? They answered 7. And then last question, he said to them, do you still not understand? Do you still not understand? So Jesus was trying to get something across to the disciples about spiritual truth, and they were still trying to figure out bread and fishes and baskets and all these other things. They were missing the point of Jesus' teaching. He asked them numerous questions to try to get them to think, try to get them to understand. One commentator uses verse 21 to say these words, kind of wrapping up the whole picture of this incident. He said, after the questioning, Jesus concluded with this final question, actually a repetition of what he asked in the second half of verse 17. And at this point, Jesus moved from his questions of rebuke to a plea for their spiritual insight. The verb said is a present tense verb. He was saying to them, indicating that Jesus was now focusing in on the most significant point. His appeal was for them to ponder and take to heart what he had been teaching them. Matthew notes that the disciples finally realized exactly what Jesus was saying to them, how Jesus was talking to them, not of regular leaven, but of the doctrine of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So they finally got it, that Jesus was talking about the belief system that had so engulfed Judaism of the day, the legalism, the liberalism, because the Sadducees actually were here on this particular event. I mean, of all these things that were taking place, This is what you need to avoid. Watch out for these theological teachings coming from this group of people, which really have nothing to do with the truth of God. So it said Jesus was much more concerned about the penetrating and permeating effects of false teaching than he was about physical food. Further, he was concerned that the disciples would understand who he was, the Messiah of Israel, the one who is the bread of life. At that point, I could jump into John's gospel, of course, and go over there, but we'll stop for today. Having understood that Jesus is trying to help us understand. His words are not to hide things from us and give us mysteries that someone will have to decode with a computer. No, we just need to understand what he does say. Somebody once asked the great Mark Twain if he was concerned about all the things he didn't understand in the Bible. He said, no, I'm concerned with the things I do understand. And that's the way you and I should be. Don't worry about the secret messages that some folks say might be hidden therein. Instead, take to heart what Jesus is teaching us and take his wisdom to heart, understanding who he is. He is the Messiah. He is the Son of God. He is the Lord, and it is his truth that matters. And watch out for some of these strange theological systems of man that often just build houses of cards that will be easily blown down when it counts. Will you hang in there today, regardless of whether you're facing storms in the Gulf of Mexico or just the storms of life? May the Lord Jesus Christ be with you, to care for you, to lift you up, to feed you with manna from heaven until he comes. I'll see you again right here tomorrow as we wake up in the Word.